Good morning, and welcome to day 3 of the Mandiant Cyber Defense Summit 2021 here. At Mandiant, one of the things that sets us apart is our expertise from the front lines. It is all of the knowledge, the intelligence we gather from conducting hundreds and thousands of investigations into some of the most complex cyber intrusions out there. And it's always been our mission at Mandiant that we want to share this expertise, this knowledge with you and with the broader cybersecurity community. So today, we're going to be looking at a threat that we've been talking about fairly extensively here at CDS, a threat that's received a lot of attention also from the media, made the front pages many times over the past year. I'm talking, of course, about multifaceted extortion, the evolution of ransomware. And more specifically, today, we want to look at what represents effective cyber defense. Our work at the front lines gives us a unique perspective, unique visibility into what represents effective cyber defense. And while there are no magic solutions here, no easy buttons to be found, there are a lot of things organizations can do to prepare for these types of attacks. Now, ransomware is nothing new. It's been around for quite a few years. But over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen an interesting evolution here. We've seen an evolution of leading from ransomware to what we now call multifaceted extortions. Attackers are no longer only encrypting systems, critical data, key servers. They're also now starting to run more complex denial of service attacks. They're stealing data out of environments, and they even are focusing on doing public shaming here. Now, the problem is clearly becoming a lot more complex, right? Backups are no longer a sufficient strategy for organizations alone. And the defense strategy that organizations are putting together needs to evolve. It needs to be dynamic in nature.
And that multifaceted extortion, it's really just about leverage. The more pain that an attacker can either threaten to unleash on a victim or offer to relieve from a victim, the more likely that victim is going to pay a ransom, and the more they can ask of that victim.
And the problem is not just only getting more complex, it's getting more expensive. If you look at some of these numbers behind me here, they paint a pretty clear and a pretty grim story. Over $1 billion is what we spend on average per year across the entire industry for ransomware payments. The average ransomware costs $84,000 to victim organizations. Kevin mentioned during his keynote that we see a huge increase in the number of ransomware attacks. And to put it in numbers, we've almost seen the number of cases double between 2019 and 2020, right? But there's another important fact here to consider when you think about ransomware. It's the median dwell time, only 5 days. When you compare that to the almost 50 days of non-ransomware attacks, it is very clear organizations have very little time to respond to these types of attacks.
Yeah, and this increase in ransomware, it's really just been part of a fundamental shift in how financially motivated threat actors are monetizing their breaches. And I think one of the interesting statistics that I see is from 2016 to 2020, we saw a 93% decrease in the amount of payment card data theft breaches that we saw. And that's just as that sort of way to monetize breaches have fallen off a cliff, ransomware has sort of risen in its ashes.
And during CDS here, during the last few days, we had many guest speakers from governments all throughout the world have joined us here. And it's very encouraging to see how governments are taking ransomware attacks a lot more serious, right? I mean, we heard from General Nakasone how in the US, ransomware could become a national security issue. We've heard a lot about sanctions to disrupt the payment chain, the ransom payment chain. But we're also seeing and hearing more about breach disclosure laws, but also support programs being put in place for victim organizations. This is a global problem. It'll require governments from all throughout the world to come together and respond in a unified voice to these types of attacks, to these types of incidents. But it's also critical to realize it's not just the government's role to protect us, of course. Every organization needs to make sure they take their own steps and think about preparedness. Now, I want to look at what it means to be prepared for a ransomware attack, for a multifaceted extortion attack. You got to remember, you have very little time to respond. The first thing is all about attack surface management. Organizations need to have a good understanding about their risk profile, their threat profile, and more importantly, they need to have comprehensive visibility across the entire environment. They cannot afford to have blind spots. But you also heard Chris Key talk in his keynote a lot about automated defense and scalability, processing alerts. Most security operations center, most cyber defense center deal with hundreds of thousands and millions of alerts every single day. And that becomes extremely difficult for those analysts to make sense of all of these alerts. You need an automated solution that provides you with scalability, an automated solution that can tell your analysts what are the true incidents they need to focus on. And when one of those incidents hits you, you need to have solid intelligence. You need to be able to perform attribution. Because the way you will respond to a ransomware attack in the initial stages of the attack lifecycle is going to be very different from how you, for example, respond to a nation-state threat actor who's trying to steal your intellectual property. It's a very different type of problem and a very different type of response that is going to be required. Now, we also talked, of course, over the last decade or longer about effective security architecture. We talked about how important multi-factor authentication is across the entire enterprise for all your external accessible systems, for all your users without any exceptions. We talked a lot about network segmentation, good restrictive identity access management, least privileges, right? All of these best practices are also extremely effective ultimately to help you protect, to slow down these types of ransom attacks. And last, of course, but not least, our industry has been struggling with a permanent shortage of skills, of talent. And it is important for you to invest into your people. An analyst, a security analyst, should not experience their first ransom attack when it is live in your network. An analyst needs to be prepared. They need to have the opportunity to work in, for example, a cyber range environment to test their skills. They need continuous training, education, but they also need to participate at red teaming exercises, purple teaming exercises, tabletop exercises that encompass the entire organization are all critical to help prepare your defenders for a potential attack.
And sometimes this problem of building an effective cyber defense program to combat the threats of today and things like ransomware almost feels intractable. In fact, I've been at Mandiant Consulting since 2006, and it's been one of our unofficial mottos that breaches are inevitable. But coupled with that is that impactful breaches are preventable, and it is possible to mitigate the impact of breaches, even if you are a victim. And I do think that some of the things that Jurgen's talking about are achievable. Even if you don't have a perfect cyber defense program, as we're going to explore a little bit later in our case studies, even incremental changes in some of the areas that Jurgen is emphasizing can have a significant impact in terms of reducing your impact from a breach.
So, what are the risks of not being prepared for an organization, right? Well, the later you detect these types of attacks in the attacker lifecycle, the more impactful they will be, right? Our goal is to help organizations stop these attacks before attackers can deploy encryptors, before they can steal data, before they can publicly shame organizations, right? But it's also about the ability to prevent the spread of these types of attacks, having these attackers move throughout your environment and potentially even get into other environments, partner networks, etc., or potentially re-compromising you post-remediation. That's what it is. Those are the risks of being unprepared. And of course, also an important element is not just preparing for the investigation, it is also preparing for remediation, right? Otherwise, you run the risk of having a very long and costly remediation cycle. And of course, again, the risks are also being potentially on the front pages. It is about the client visibility that you're getting, the cost that continuously increases the longer these types of attacks continue to run in your environment. So, as Nick mentioned, we want to walk you through a scenario here. We're walking you through a scenario of a multifaceted extortion attack. And we're going to look at this through the eyes of two different victim organizations. The first victim is going to be an organization that has been well prepared to deal with these types of attacks. The second organization is going to be an organization that has not had the same level of preparedness. And we're going to look at each stage of the attacker life cycle, and we're going to see how being prepared results in a different outcome for these types of attacks. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Jurgen. And whenever I do an anonymous case study like this, I always change some details or maybe merge a couple cases together just to protect the identity of the victims. And in these cases, it was actually extremely easy to do that. And the reason is because these are pretty ordinary cases. For anyone in this room or listening online, if you're an incident responder or if you've been the victim of ransomware or multifaceted extortion yourselves, you'll probably recognize some of the details of this case in your own cases. And that's on purpose. I think by looking at the sort of intrusions that we investigate every single day, I think it's very instructive for what you need to do to actually protect yourself in the real world. So let's jump into it here. And in this case, neither victim had a perfect cyber defense program, as I think will become clear. Both of these cases happened towards the end of 2020. Both victims were medium to large-sized companies, north of 5,000 employees each, and they were the victims of the same attack campaign. And in this case, the attacker gained initial access through phishing. So they sent a phishing email, contained a link to a site. The site had a malicious link to a file in Google Drive. Some users downloaded that, opened it on their computer, resulted in malware being executed on their computer and the attacker installing what we call the keg tap backdoor on a few different workstations in each environment. That gave the attacker access to each environment persistently on a few different workstations. At that point, we suspect the attacker sold access or transferred access to another attack group. Fairly common these days where we see attackers kind of specialize in different pieces of the attacker lifecycle. From there, that new attacker started using the beacon backdoor, moving laterally, and started doing the kind of things that are just standard tradecraft these days for escalating privileges in an environment and doing what they need to do. So they use publicly available tools like AD, Find, and Bloodhound just to enumerate the internal environment and identify those paths that they could use to escalate their privileges and accomplish their goals. They took the information from that and they performed a very commonly known attack vector called Kerber roasting. That gave them access to credentials for a few semi-privileged credentials and accounts. They used those to move laterally around the environment, perform password harvesting, and eventually gain access to credentials for accounts that were in the domain admins group, aka sort of the keys to the kingdom in both environments. And around the end of that chain of events in each cases, each victim realized they were compromised, started to understand the magnitude of the situation, and then called us to start an investigation. And obviously a lot went wrong to this point, but you'll notice I haven't said the word ransomware, I haven't said the word encryptor, and that goes back to one of Jurgen's points earlier about preparedness. Being prepared for ransomware events and being prepared to be able to detect ransomware threat actors has to do with that entire attacker lifecycle, not just the end game of encryptors and ransoms, et cetera. Also, we would have loved to be called in earlier. The sooner you're able to detect what the attacker's doing, the less they've done and the more options you have as a defender to respond to that.
And when we talk about being called in earlier, as Nick was saying, we see a lot of missed opportunities in many of the investigations we conduct. We see that control technologies generated alerts during the early stages of the attack life cycle. These alerts were sent to the Cyber Defense Center, but unfortunately were not properly interpreted. They got lost in the noise. Analysts didn't know what to make with them, didn't see the complete picture. They analyzed them as individual alerts rather than being part of a larger incident and treated them as such. This represents a huge missed opportunity.
That's right. So now with both victims, our response begins. We can start an enterprise-wide incident response investigations for both cases. So that means we're trying to trace back that attack path that I just walked through and also identify what else the attacker could have done, how else they might be entering the environment so that we're able to eradicate them later. Then we take what we know about the attacker so far, their malware, their TTPs, their command and control channels that they're using, and we use that to identify the attacker, and we identify that this is a financially motivated threat actor, and every time we've seen them before, they've deployed ransomware. So now we know ransomware is coming. And from that point forward, that dramatically changes everything we do moving forward. There's some tactical things that we had to do that I'll get into in a minute, but it also just changes our entire kind of our mindset and our strategy. The victim knows that if ransomware is deployed in this environment, it could cripple their environment. It could have really significant business impact. So that gives us the latitude as responders to be much more heavy-handed in how we respond. Maybe do things that would cause disruptions to the business that we wouldn't do otherwise. It also means that we're up against the clock. We know the attackers there have the privileges, what they're planning to do. It's almost like there's a bomb that's going to go off in this environment, and we have to get them out before it does. And that also means that the people that I'm talking to on the phone right now, the people that are collected, likely aren't going to be doing a lot of sleeping over the next few days. Now, Kevin mentioned in his keynote on Tuesday that the reality of incident response in 1998 was a 20-something-year-old sitting alone in a data center duplicating drives at 4 a.m. Well, the reality of incident response for ransomware investigations in 2020 and 2021 has been people sitting alone in sometimes makeshift home offices, not sleeping by themselves, and sometimes taking a nap at 3 a.m. on the floor so they don't wake up their family. So it can be hell on these victims. So when Kevin asked General Nakasone yesterday, or I guess Tuesday, whether we'd still be dealing with these sort of attacks every single day in 5 years, I'm not going to lie, I held my breath waiting for that answer. And unfortunately, he answered it the same way that I would have, that this is not going away. It's something that we're going to continue to see. And although that intelligence, was maybe disheartening to people in the room, it was absolutely critical, going back to Jurgen's points of preparedness earlier. Having that intelligence, knowing what the attacker was going to do, it changed everything we were going to do from that point forward. Okay, so at this point, we start working with each victim and thinking about what could we do if we need to get the attacker out of the environment and other things that we need to do. The first thing that came up was some of the tactical things that we need to think about. And we know this attack vector, or we know this attacker, not only deploys encryptors, they do other things to disrupt the on-prem identity provider Active Directory. So we start working with them on tactical things they need to do to back up pieces of Active Directory, isolate domain controllers, et cetera. Working with victim one, very easy. They already had these backups in place. We talked about the domain controller isolation, 5-minute conversation, immediately moved on. Victim two, it was just a little bit more challenging. They had never done this backing up. They had never thought through how they were going to do it. So there was just that little bit of education, little bit of working them through things. And it probably only saved an hour, 2 hours, something in that range. But that can have a really big impact. I was working a similar case maybe a year ago, and we were having these conversations with the customer, talking about containment actions, said, let's meet up in 2 hours, got off the phone, and before that next meeting started, the attacker started deploying their encryptors everywhere. So just those little things being prepared can save minutes and hours, which can actually be critical in responses like this.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. A couple of quick lessons learned when it comes to backups. As Nick already said, don't practice restoration for the first time when you're dealing with an active ransomware attack, right? There are times when you have to do that well ahead of these types of attacks. But there's, of course, a lot of other important lessons. Also, one is to protect your backups. We do see these attackers trying to target your backups. They realize this is your lifeline. This will make the difference between you probably paying a ransom or not paying a ransom. So they will try to find out where those backups are, and they'll try to encrypt them. And finally, of course, also think about scalability. When you deal with a ransomware attack and encryption throughout your environment, you're not just going to have to restore 1 or 2 critical systems. Chances are you'll have to restore dozens, if not hundreds of systems. So ask yourself the question, does my backup solution scale to this type of need? Is it going to be effective when I deal with these types of situations?
And again, continuing that conversation with the victims about how can we get this attacker out. At this point, we're at about T-minus 10 minutes with victims 2, and probably T-minus 2 hours, or with victim 1, excuse me, and probably T-minus 2 hours with victim 2. So when we start talking with them, what can we do to get this attacker out? Knowing we don't know every single backdoor they're using, so we can't be very surgical about it. Talking with victim 1 about their infrastructure, they confirm all of their remote access requires multi-factor authentication. We have access to their logs in a centralized location for the remote access. Comparing or working through their knowledge of their environment and our investigative findings to date, we become reasonably certain that the only way the attacker is accessing this environment is through backdoors installed on internal systems that are reaching out to their command and control infrastructure. So we decide, hey, if we need to, we can just shut off all outbound traffic from this network, and we can probably stop the attacker. And the victim actually had a playbook in place to do so. We put that in our back pocket. We know we can do that later if we need to. With victim 2, it was a little bit more challenging. We have the same discussion. They tell us multi-factor authentication is required for all of their remote access. But what we found out later was there happened to be the Citrix portal that they didn't think about, that only a few users use, but that only needed single-factor authentication. And those logs weren't being aggregated centrally. And what we found out even further in the investigation was the attacker was using it. In addition, when we had those conversations about what can we do to just block all outbound traffic, they didn't know how to do that. They had never done that in their environment. They had never worked through the logistics of it, so they had to go send somebody to plan to see what that would look like. And what all this equals is, the security architecture and attack surface management that Jurgen mentioned is critical. I can't tell you how many times we've sat in a room with the victim, talked about their external access and remote access, only to find out what they told us was wrong. So validating those assumptions about your environment is critical to giving you the information you need and the leverage you need to respond during an incident. And that obviously also goes into visibility. Having that visibility into the logs with victim 1 versus victim 2 gives us more confidence in what we know about the attacker to be able to make those decisions. And then finally, just general preparedness. The fact that they had this playbook in place that we could execute it just gives us much more cards to play with victim 1 versus victim 2. Next, we talked to each victim about doing some rapid triage of their environment to support containment and eradication activities. Now, when I first put this slide together, I probably had about 450 words detailing every little thing that was wrong with each environment in terms of their security architecture, and Jurgen told me to get rid of it all. And Jurgen happens to be my boss's boss, so now there's only 4 bullets on this slide. But Jurgen was right. We could probably spend hours talking about how to build effective security architecture. But I think the takeaway from this is, at this point in an investigation, you don't know everything that's going on. You don't know exactly all the ways the attacker is getting into the environment, so you likely can't completely eradicate them. But what we might be able to do is contain their activity, limit what they're able to do. And ransomware attackers, they want to deploy their encryptors on as many systems as possible. And in order to do that, they need access to the right privileged credentials and they access the right technology. So we started working with both victims to say, what can we do to gain positive control of the most privileged credentials in each environment? Victim 1, there was plenty of issues we found in the triage, but we were able to work with them to formulate a plan and then execute that plan over that night to regain control over their most privileged accounts in the environment, limiting what the attacker can do from that point forward. Victim 2 was not nearly as easy. Not only were there more technical weaknesses, but they were lacking documentation and knowledge and know-how. So the incident responders weren't able to identify for these accounts and these systems who owned them, who was responsible for them, what they were used for, who was even authorized to make decisions associated with them. So all of those things were just individual roadblocks stopping us from being able to execute our plan the way that we wanted to. And what that resulted for victim 2 was an extended cat and mouse game trying to keep the attacker out of those privileged accounts. And what that tells us, simply is strong security architecture begets strong cyber defense. Even though victim 1 had plenty of issues that allowed the attacker to get to where they were, those stronger controls gave us possibilities to move quicker and execute quicker. And it's not just the technical controls, it's the documentation, ownership, authorization, things like that that allowed us to execute in victim 1 where we couldn't in victim 2. And finally, goes back to Jurgen's point around human expertise. Now, I happened to get the chance to eat dinner on Monday with a number of people that are incident responders from a couple different companies, and the conversation ended up at kind of this point. When we're at this point in an investigation for ransomware, what is the thing that differentiates the victims that are successful versus the victims that are unsuccessful? And the number one thing everybody said was the human expertise of the employees at the victims. Did they have knowledge of their environment, knowledge of technology, knowledge of the attacker? Were they authorized and emboldened by leadership to execute and do things in their environment? By far was the number one thing people said differentiated success from this point forward.
Yeah, and this is where we enter really the hardest phase of the investigation, right? This is what we call sort of the hand-to-hand combat phase, really. This is where the attackers try to deploy encryptors. They try to leverage privileged accounts to get encryptors throughout the environment, steal data. And our responders are trying to stop this type of attack. Nick mentioned in his opening statements the times that our consultants sleep underneath their desk to not wake up their families, in case you didn't guess it already. Nick is one of those consultants, obviously. But this is a problem that we see, right? This is a very, very demanding phase for our clients, for our consultants alike. This is where every advantage that you can gain is absolutely critical. Nick talked a lot about the access control and privileged accounts. Being able to take away privileged accounts, for example, from the attackers can slow them down and can make the difference between the attackers being successful at completing their mission or us being able to protect the victim organization here.
And in both cases at this point, after we'd been there for a few days, the attacker struck, attempted to deploy encryptors across their entire environment. With victim 1, it actually failed based on the changes we had made to privileges in their environment. So victim 1 detected that. They were nervous. They didn't know what was going to happen next, so they decided, you know what, this is the time. Let's block all outbound traffic. It did have disruption to business, but it stopped the attacker from that point forward, allowed us to finish the investigation, finish the eradication, and move on. In the case of victim 2, the attacker was successful in deploying their encryptors, and the victim didn't feel that they could get the attacker out. They didn't feel they could control privileges, stop them from what they were doing. They felt helpless. So what they ended up doing was actually en masse just shutting down systems to stop the propagation of encryptors and stop the encryption from going forward. Obviously having huge impact of their business, public-facing, customer-facing impact of their business. And it's just all the things we talked about from this point so far. That victim 1 had better visibility. They were better prepared. They had stronger controls. At this point, they had to make decisions with imperfect information, but because they had all those things in place, it made us more confident in those decisions, and it gave us the ability to execute on those decisions, while victim 2 simply could not. And finally, that left victim 2 faced with recovering from a ransomware incident and negotiating with the attacker. In this case, the attacker ended up stealing data as well and threatening to release it. The victim didn't feel that they could keep the attacker out of their systems, so needing help with the decryptors for recovery, facing the prospect of their sensitive data being leaked, just wanting to get the attacker to back down so they can regain control of the environment, they felt forced to pay a ransom, and they paid that ransom in millions. And even once they paid the ransom, it wasn't over for them. They found that it was pretty challenging to recover their environment because it wasn't just, decrypting individual systems. It's decrypting systems at scale, and it's bringing back technology. It's bringing back applications, and they were just completely unprepared to do that. And this kind of ties back to Jurgen's initial slide, which is that multifaceted extortion. It just provides that additional leverage to force victims when they feel helpless to pay the ransoms and to pay sometimes very large ransoms. And in addition, as Jurgen mentioned earlier, the preparation for ransomware is more than just preparing for an investigation and remediation, but you need to prepare for that recovery as well. Assume everything goes wrong and be ready to recover at scale. In this case, it took the victim weeks. That meant lost revenue, lost customers that they could have avoided if they were prepared for recovery.
So let's take a look at the key takeaways here to wrap it up. The first one I spoke about is attack surface management, understanding your environment, having comprehensive visibility, right? It's also investing into your cyber defense capability, automated tools that help you reduce the alert volume, right? Chris Key had some interesting statistics in his presentation about the criticality of bringing those millions of alerts down to a few incidents that truly matter. And of course, attribution intelligence, knowing who is your enemy, what are they trying to do, is very, very critical. We talked about security architecture, overall preparedness, how it provides a different outcome for potential victim organizations. And of course, last but not least, it's the human expertise, right, that makes a key difference here. Having prepared responders by your side is absolutely critical to the success of these types of attacks. Now, I want to finish things off with just two quick announcements. First and foremost, I'm really pleased to also announce here that during CDS, we launched Mandiant Academy. At Mandiant, we've always been focused on providing training and education, not just to law enforcement, but to organizations all throughout the world. And we have a very complete portfolio of services and capabilities, whether that is public and private classes, in person, or of course now also virtual classes, cyber range for employees to train in. We've brought all of these capabilities together under the umbrella of Mandiant Academy. But more importantly, we're also announcing our certification program. Our certification program that now for the first time allows you to be Mandiant certified. We're launching that later this month for incident responder and cyber threat analysts, so available later in October. And then, of course, Last but not least, I want to talk just briefly and mention the book we published here. If you want to hear more about how to prepare for these types of attack, what it is to have good cyber defense capabilities, I recommend to you, grab a copy of this book. If you're here in person today at CDS, we do have copies available outside on the showroom floor. And if you're joining us virtually, please feel free to download the ebook from our website at mandiant.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.